be having this conversation again in January, because really what this comes down to is this fight for extending healthcare subsidies, which sounds like a domestic issue, but as we've seen the last couple of weeks, it has reverberations far beyond that.
Pakistan is a nuclear power. I think this has quite sweeping potential ramifications because mostly because of Pakistan's geography, right? This could lead to greater conflict, not less, with India over the next few years. For Middle East security more broadly, this could have ramifications. And also the Pakistan-China relationship.
It's a fascinating background, and I think this is really where it gets interesting. So for years, he was only known as this fighter named Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and the leader of Syria's al-Qaeda branch. He had a $10 million U.S. bounty on his head.
Hi, I'm Dhruva Jaishankar.
And I'm Rachel Rizzo. Welcome to the Around the World podcast, your essential guide to understanding the forces shaping our world today. Every week, we cut through the noise to bring you clear, insightful analysis on some of the most important developments in geopolitics.
Whether security challenges across Europe, shifting power dynamics in Asia, domestic updates from the United States, or regional developments in Latin America or the Middle East, we'll make sure you're up to speed on what's happening and, more importantly, why it matters.
Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to like and subscribe to the Around the World podcast on both Spotify and YouTube. And now onto the show. Happy Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday, Rachel. Where are you speaking from?
I'm in Washington, and you are in New Delhi?
I'm in New Delhi this week.
Yeah. How is everything?
Great. We'll talk about it in just a bit, but later in the show, I guess we'll be talking about the end, hopefully, of the U.S. government shutdown, which has been 40 plus days, one of the longest shutdowns in recent history. Pakistan's constitutional amendment, what's happening there, why it matters. It actually has pretty sweeping ramifications, and Trump also hosts Syria's new leader and why that's important. So that's later in the show. But briefly, I've been in India. It's been pretty dramatic here. There was a terrorist attack a few days ago. In fact, I found to my I was a little horrified to find out that it was a car explosion was actually not too far from where I was earlier that afternoon. I was meeting somebody not too far away, but fortunately it was very far away when the explosion did occur. So initially there was some confusion about whether it was actually intentional, whether it was a terrorist attack. It now appears as if it was. And it was a cell that had been mostly captured. It was a group of mostly doctors who had stockpiled some explosive material. They'd been mostly detained and captured, but it appears as if one of the perpetrators that slipped through and was able to detonate. We had over 8 to 10 people killed, and the explosion took place very close to one of the most popular tourist sites in New Delhi.
Yeah, by the Red Fort, right?
The Red Fort, yeah.
Yeah.
We've also, this week in Delhi, had a really horrible pollution. It's led to protests. There were none today. A few days ago, there were some public protests. So we had really high AQI. It's led to some partial school closures. And in fact, some policies like certain cars are not being allowed on the road, older vehicles, diesel vehicles, non-essential construction, mining, and other activities have also been suspended.
Okay.
So that's also, it's been like the worst year possibly since the pandemic.
Wow.
So that's facing firsthand. A few other stories just to watch, and I'm curious what else you've been interested in. China formally launched a new aircraft carrier this week. A few other developments in China. We've been seeing a bit of a China-Japan spat over comments made by the new prime minister in Japan on Taiwan. We had the consul general in Osaka, Chinese consul general in Osaka in Japan, making a statement where he seemed to imply that people who stuck their noses into things would be beheaded, and that's caused a lot of controversy because people are implying that it was sort of in poor taste.
Yeah.
Another recent development, there's been a new study that shows that U.S. investment in Africa now exceeds Chinese investment in Africa.
That's actually huge, because that has not been the case since I think like 2013 or something.
Yeah, this was from 2023 data. It may have changed since then, but even that fact is quite significant. At the same time, China is making a major investment in Guinea in a major iron mine, which could really have some strong geopolitical ramifications. This is a high quality iron ore mine. It would be I think it's the most expensive mining project ever in the world.
Oh, wow.
So I think we're talking $23+ billion. And China has got a piece of that now. And again, there's some people are watching that to see if that shifts some of the balance in the iron ore markets away from Australia and Brazil and some of the other traditional heavyweights. Last thing I'd mention, Thailand has suspended its peace agreement with Cambodia. This was the thing that Trump sort of claimed to have brokered, and there was an incident where some Thai soldiers stepped on a landmine, led to some injuries, and it's led to a bit of a deterioration in relations again.
Okay, so we'll probably dive into that at some point, because I don't think that's something that we've talked about. Probably be worth it to do a episode where we get someone who's an expert on like mining and critical minerals. So that's something for us to watch closely as well.
So turning to you, what's happened with the government shutdown?
Yeah, so this is the big news story in the U.S. this week. It's been the biggest news story, I would say, for the last 41 days, which is how long the government shutdown lasted. It was officially the longest one in history. Just a couple days ago, a bipartisan Senate deal was reached to fund the government through January 30th and to set a vote on an Affordable Care Act bill in December. There were 8 Democrats who defected to come over to the other side to make sure that this went through. Obviously, it's caused a lot of complaints and frustration among the Democrats because it seemed as though when you looked at polling, Republicans were actually the ones that were being blamed for this shutdown. And so a lot of people feel like the Democrats sort of, fell over and kind of gave in to Republican demands. But we'll see how this plays out. The final version extends government funding through January 2026. So it's looking like there's a chance we could be doing this all over again in just a couple of months.
So just kicks the can down the road. Briefly, if I can ask you, what are the potential international implications? I mean, why should people outside of the U.S. care what has come back online that wasn't functioning over the past 41 days?
I mean, look, I think what ends up happening when you have a government shutdown is all non-essential employees go home because there is no money to fund their work. There's no money to fund their salaries. In fact, essential employees that go to work are ending up having to get back pay. And so what we started seeing in the U.S. was major flight cancellations. The first day of flight cancellations was last week, and it started at 4%. Then it went up to 7, 8, almost 10% this week. And so what that does, I think, internationally is it really shows that the United States is in a somewhat of a dysfunctioning state, certainly a highly polarized state. But things like, international visits, many of those got cut. Same with international visits here to the United States. Non-essential employees in places like the State Department, the Pentagon, Commerce, Energy, all of the major departments in the U.S. weren't working. And so this really does have broader reverberations beyond just the United States and beyond just the dysfunction that it represents. So let's see how long we can keep this settled for. But certainly, I think we're going to be having this conversation again in January because really what this comes down to is this fight for extending healthcare subsidies, which sounds like a domestic issue, but as we've seen the last couple of weeks, it has reverberations far beyond that. And then one other thing I would say is that, healthcare is the big issue right now, but I think if there was another president in place, say it was like a Nikki Haley or someone else who wasn't seen as such an authoritarian figure by the Democrats, I really wonder that whether or not they would have decided to shut down the government. Ezra Klein actually at the New York Times did a really good podcast on this the other day, kind of asking this exact question. I think it'd be worth going back to listen to. So this has stuff to do with just Trump in general as well. So we'll watch this closely and tackle it again in January if we have to.
Right.
And then on your end, shifting it far away from the United States, going to the international community, you mentioned that in Pakistan, Munir has kind of consolidated power through this constitutional amendment. Tell us a little bit about what is going on there.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background on that. So, if we'd been having this conversation on Pakistan 9 months ago, this was a country that was looking very inward at that time, and it had sort of a triple crisis on its hands. There was real political polarization, largely because of the immense popularity on the streets of Imran Khan, the former prime minister, who's been jailed. And really, you have a sort of a coalition of everybody else, actors, the army, various political parties, and others who have very little in common otherwise, but were all interested in keeping Imran Khan out of power, essentially. Mm-hmm. So there was that tension that was there domestically. They were facing difficulties on their western border, particularly in Balochistan, province of Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, with Pashtuns on the west. So there were some internal security challenges they were facing, and the economy was looking in pretty bad shape. Now, what happened was in May, as you may recall, there was this 3-4 day conflict between India and Pakistan. And one of the consequences of that was that Asim Munir, the chief of army staff, was really able to consolidate power. There was a real sort of rallying around the flag in Pakistan. So people, mm-hmm. It bolstered the military's popularity. And he promoted himself to field marshal and really kind of consolidated himself politically. And so what we're seeing in some ways is a consequence of that. There's a 27th constitutional amendment that was passed by both the Senate and the lower house of parliament. This gives him effective command over all the other services. He was only chief of army staff. It's basically done away with the chairman joint chiefs of staff, which is more of a ceremonial position in Pakistan, but he's become chief of defense staff more broadly. It consolidates his term. He has legal immunity for life. Which is quite significant.
Yeah.
And he also has command over the nuclear forces. So this gives him pretty sweeping powers. He's probably now the most powerful general in Pakistan since Musharraf, who became president, some 20 years ago. So this is really quite consequential for that reason. It's coincided, I think, two other things just to keep in mind. One is Munir has able to consolidate relations with certain key external actors over the past few months. China, notably, Pakistan mm-hmm. is the largest recipient of Chinese arms. Turkey and Azerbaijan, these three countries, Pakistan, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, call themselves the Three Brothers. They have a very close relationship.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia, so they announced a mutual defense treaty, although the exact terms of that treaty are a bit vague. There's a lot of speculation. Is it sort of a de facto extension of Pakistan's nuclear deterrent? But again, that's subject to some interpretation, and also with the United States. So in some ways, Munir has been able to consolidate relations with some of these key actors. At the same time, he does continue to face domestic challenges. The economy isn't great. Inflation has come down, but the economy isn't in great shape. They may have to go back to the IMF for bailouts in the future. There's been another conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Taliban-led Afghanistan now on the west. So both India and Afghanistan, they're facing very direct security challenges. And India has also put in abeyance the Indus Waters Treaty, which guaranteed the flow of some waters from India to Pakistan, which may have some impact for farmers as well. Okay. It's a kind of precarious situation we're in right now, where you have a very powerful leader who is quite ideologically motivated. He gave a very controversial speech in April or so of this year, before the conflict with India, or I think it was a little earlier in the year, which was in India was seen as quite alarming and quite divisive. So he's quite ideologically motivated. He's got more political power than, again, almost any military leader in Pakistan in 2 decades. And again, is not risk averse. Okay. And so a combination of feeling emboldened from these diplomatic relationships that he has managed to forge, but also kind of cornered by India and Afghanistan, could have some consequences.
So I'll ask you the same question that you asked me. What do these domestic developments mean for the international community and mean for Pakistan's role both in the region and as a global player? Or is it more consolidated within the country and we'll have to see what happens there first?
Oh, no, I think this has quite sweeping potential ramifications because mostly because of Pakistan's geography, right? Mm-hmm. So again, this could lead to greater conflict, not less, with India over the next few years. The situation I outlined doesn't inspire a lot of confidence for stability in the region. Pakistan is a nuclear power. it has a role. It is trying to play a role in the Middle East of various kinds, whether it's providing access to airspace for Iran-related contingencies, whether it's security in Saudi Arabia, whether it's the proposed peacekeepers to Gaza as part of the settlement plan. So Pakistan is trying to like fashion itself as a sort of regional player, for better or for worse. I mean, it could have a blowback effect. There was for example, there were Pakistani soldiers a few years ago captured in Yemen who were fighting on behalf of the Saudis, and that had again some. So there, for Middle East security more broadly, this could have ramifications. And also the Pakistan-China relationship. We're seeing Pakistan becoming, in some ways, a test bed for Chinese weapon systems, and more than that, Chinese doctrine and practices, which they're emulating more what China is doing. Recently, in August of this year, Pakistan unveiled a new rocket forces, strategic rocket forces, which is modeled in part on China's. So I think again, this isn't just a domestic issue; it has implications for India, the United States, for nuclear stability, for the Middle East, and for China.
Okay, lots of ramifications there.
Yeah. Lastly, turn to you. We had a really interesting, unusual visit by Syria's new leader to Washington. Tell us about it.
I mean, unusual is a good way to describe it. Unprecedented, historic. These are also words that we could use. Ahmed al-Sharaa, it was his first visit to Washington, the first visit to the White House by a Syrian head of state since Syria gained its independence from France in 1946. So I think it's really important to get some context here. So this is the 43-year-old leader who led the rebel forces that toppled former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad last December. He then went ahead and appointed himself as president of Syria back in January. This is his 20th trip as leader, as he really tries to reverse what has been decades of Syrian isolation on the world stage. And he's really trying to reinvent his country diplomatically, not just within the Middle East, but globally as well.
And what is his, I mean, he has a really interesting background. What tell us a little bit about his background.
It's a fascinating background. And I think this is really where it gets interesting. So back in the early 2000s, he joined the Islamist insurgents who were at the time battling U.S. forces in Iraq. He was then captured by U.S. forces in 2006 and then jailed for 5 years, released in 2011, crossed the border into Syria, and then when he got to Syria, established an al-Qaeda-backed rebel army to fight against the forces who were loyal to the then President Assad. So for years, he was only known as this fighter named Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and the leader of Syria's al-Qaeda branch. He had a $10 million U.S. bounty on his head. What ended up happening then is that he divorced himself from al-Qaeda and then ended up leading the forces who toppled Assad. And interestingly enough, the U.S. sent a delegation back in December to meet with him for the first time. And that is when they ended up removing the $10 million bounty. This is not his first trip to the United States. Yeah. He came to the U.S. for UN meetings back in September. And it was a super fascinating moment because he was on stage at the Concordia Summit next to David Petraeus, who interviewed him. And this was the general who commanded U.S. forces during their invasion of Iraq, the exact forces who captured al-Sharaa and imprisoned him for 5 years. So just an immensely fascinating turnaround for this person.
I was in New York, actually, when that happened. And it was all these conspiracy theories floating about of like having a former CIA director with the jailer and the jailee, the person
the captor and the captive, so many
together.
things.
But there were all these online. There were all these conspiracy theories floating about that as well.
Yeah, it's wild.
So anyway, so what now? What came out of his meeting with Trump? By the way, just a funny thing. He has a sort of weird dynamic or some interesting dynamic with Trump. Like Trump jokes with him when he meets him, and he asks him like, "Oh, how many wives do you have?" and things like that.
Yeah, and he's like very strong man. Like and this was like like months he's been saying these things.
Yeah, I think the first time Trump met him at some summit, he was like, "Oh, he's really handsome. He's a good-looking guy." And stuff
exactly.
Like that.
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry. So what came out of the White House meeting?
So what now? I mean, look, he announced that Syria is going to join the global coalition to defeat ISIS. That's a huge deal. This makes Syria the 90th member of that coalition. He's also looking to repeal what's called the Caesar Act, and this is a series of sanctions that the U.S. applied to Syria in 2019 during Assad's rule because of gross human rights abuses. So Trump has lifted sanctions, and the U.S. extended its pause on most of the other sanctions for another 180 days. But before repealing them fully, which requires an act of Congress, that's where you get into the politics now in the U.S., the domestic politics. Some foreign policy hawks, notably Lindsey Graham, really want to put requirements in place to review every 6 months before those sanctions are fully repealed. So that's something to watch. Also, the World Bank estimates that Syria is going to need $216 billion for reconstruction. So a lot of things happening at the same time here for al-Sharaa to both deal with at home and abroad. And I think this is just the beginning of a very long story, and something that I'm sure that we'll talk about again at some point.
Yeah, a few other things. I mean, with the caveat, Syria is not a place I follow that closely, but just a few other things that'd be interesting to watch going forward. Israel made gains beyond the Golan Heights into Syria. It'd be interesting to see, the future of the Israeli presence, including whether it's control over airspace, but also land as well beyond the Golan Heights. Two, Russia had established a base there in Latakia in Syria. And I think the future of the Russian presence in the Middle East also sort of hangs in the balance as well. And then, a third thing is there've been some interest in including Syria now in IMEC proposals, so India, Middle East, Europe corridor, just having more lines of communication, whether it's ground or port access on the Mediterranean, beyond just given the uncertainties in Israel. And so it's interesting how this sort of political reconfiguration in Syria could have, again, these spillover effects beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not just related to Syria. It goes far beyond, has reverberations for trade, for security, for many other topics. But as always, Dhruva and I will be keeping an eye on all of these developments and more, and making sure we're keeping you, our listeners, up to date on the latest happenings in geopolitics. So as we mentioned, make sure to tune in every Friday for new episodes. And as I mentioned at the beginning, be sure to like and subscribe to the Around the World podcast on Spotify and on YouTube.
And if there are any topics you'd like us to discuss or go into in more detail, feel free to add them in the comments, particularly in YouTube. We'll try and keep track of that. But as always, thank you for joining us on the Around the World podcast. We'll see you next week.